A millionaire in disguise ordered coffee at his own cafe, only to be humiliated by a waitress who had no idea she just insulted the man who signed her paycheck. Morning light spilled across the polished marble of downtown Brew Café, catching in the gold edges of the glass walls and glinting off rows of porcelain cups stacked in perfect order. The place was quiet, almost sacred in its elegance. Soft jazz hummed in the background, and the air smelled of roasted beans and money. The kind of cafe where business deals were sealed with designer smiles and black cards. Then the door opened. A man stepped in, dark-skinned, dressed in faded jeans and a plain t-shirt. No watch, no suit, no signs of the wealth that followed him everywhere else. Marcus Williams paused at the threshold, letting the cold air of the morning trail behind him. To everyone else, he was just another customer. To himself, he was here for something different. For weeks, rumors had reached his desk about this location, his own flagship store, whispers of customers treated differently because of the color of their skin. He didn't send an assistant, or a manager, or a legal team. He came alone. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. From behind the counter, a blonde waitress with an immaculate ponytail noticed him. Her name tag read Rachel. She leaned slightly toward the barista beside her, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the air. "We don't serve people like that here," she said. Her words floated just loud enough for him to hear. The barista looked startled, eyes darting between Marcus and Rachel. Marcus stood still. For a moment, even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to pause. Rachel went on arranging cups, pretending he didn't exist. The white couple behind him smiled politely and were served instantly, their order delivered with warmth and laughter. Marcus waited, silent. His calmness unnerved her more than anger ever could. When the couple walked away, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said. Rachel sighed, exaggeratedly, like she had been forced to notice him. "What do you want?" Her tone made every word sting. "An Americano, please." "Cash only," she said quickly. "Systems down." It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He had approved every piece of software in this store. But he played along. "How much?" $12. The real price was $4.50. Marcus looked at her, then opened his wallet and handed her a 20. She took it like she was touching something dirty. "No change," she muttered. The barista, a young man with nervous eyes, hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the cup. Marcus caught the look, shame, quiet protest, but the boy said nothing. Rachel made his coffee last, serving 3 other customers first. When she finally placed his order on the counter, it came in a thin disposable cup instead of the white porcelain the cafe was famous for. No saucer. No napkin. Not even a smile. Next, she called out, already turning away. Marcus picked up the cup. The cardboard felt rough in his hand, almost symbolic. Around him, the chatter continued, comfortable, privileged, oblivious. He looked around slowly, memorizing everything. The gold reflections on the countertop. The deliberate indifference in her eyes. The way the young barista avoided looking at him. Every detail would matter later. He took a sip. It tasted bitter, not because of the coffee, but because of the truth steeped in it. He placed the cup down carefully, nodded once, and walked toward the door. Outside, the sun was bright against the glass facade. He stopped just before stepping onto the sidewalk and glanced back through the window. Rachel was laughing now, talking to the same couple she had just served, her gestures animated, her arrogance radiant under the light. For a heartbeat, Marcus watched her. No anger. No raised voice. Just silence, the kind of silence that carried power. A faint smile crossed his face, almost invisible. The kind that comes when a decision forms not out of rage, but out of certainty. Then he turned and walked away, the bell on the cafe door ringing softly behind him, marking the exact moment when justice began to brew. Marcus sat in his car, the engine off, the city moving outside like a film he'd seen too many times. On the passenger seat, the cheap paper cup from downtown Brew sat untouched, the coffee inside already cold. The logo printed on it, his logo, stared back at him like an accusation. Through the windshield, the morning sun reflected off glass towers, flashing reminders of how far he had come and how far humanity still had to go. The radio hummed softly, a host discussing corporate diversity and how businesses were learning to be inclusive. Marcus turned the volume down. He didn't need theories. He had just witnessed the truth. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "James," he said when the line connected. "We have a problem at Downtown Brew." There was a short pause, then the deep calm voice of James Peterson, his lawyer and oldest friend. "What kind of problem?" Marcus looked at the coffee again. "The kind that smells like discrimination." James exhaled heavily. "I'll be at your office in an hour." Marcus didn't answer. He just ended the call and sat back, letting the city noise fill the silence. A delivery truck honked somewhere nearby. A woman crossed the street with her child. For a moment, he saw another woman's face reflected in the glass, the face of his mother. Donna Williams. She had worked as a cleaning lady in the downtown towers he now owned shares in. He could still remember the sound of her keys jangling as she walked into the lobby before dawn, invisible to the men in suits who stepped around her mop bucket like she wasn't there. Once, when he was 10, he'd gone to wait for her after school. He had watched the building manager scold her for taking too long to finish. The man had spoken to her without ever using her name, calling her woman like a command. Marcus had clenched his fists back then, too small to protect her, too powerless to change anything. That night, she had sat beside him at their worn kitchen table and said quietly, "One day, you'll have the respect I never had. But promise me something, son, when you do, don't forget the ones who still have to beg for it." He never forgot. Every decision, every expansion, every late night spent building his company had been guided by those words. He started with a used coffee cart parked outside a university campus, selling $5 cups to sleepy students. Rain, debt, exhaustion, he'd fought them all. What he sold wasn't just coffee. It was connection. He hired people who'd been overlooked, who spoke with accents, who wore second-hand shoes, who had been told no too many times. He believed service was a mirror of dignity. And for 15 years, that belief built an empire, 47 stores from Boston to Miami, each one a promise that no customer would ever feel invisible again. Until this morning. He turned the cup slowly in his hand, watching the sunlight catch the rim of the cardboard. That woman, Rachel, had broken more than company policy. She had shattered the core of what his business stood for. But Marcus didn't feel anger. What he felt was colder, heavier. Determination. He glanced up at the traffic light ahead, the reflection cutting across his face like a line dividing who he had been from who he was about to become. People passed by, unaware that the man in the plain t-shirt behind the wheel was the one who signed their paychecks, who owned the cafe they ordered from, who was now planning something far greater than a complaint. Injustice had a cost. He had paid it once through his mother's tears. He would not pay it again in silence. Marcus took one last look at the cup and whispered to himself, "Respect has no color." Then he set it down gently, started the engine, and pulled into traffic, his eyes steady on the road ahead. This time, he wasn't just driving home. He was driving toward a reckoning. The conference room at Williams Enterprises sat high above downtown Los Angeles, all glass and steel and silence. The skyline stretched endlessly outside, glowing in pale blue light. Marcus stood at the head of the table, the city reflected in the glass behind him. His coffee cup sat untouched, steam curling upward and fading into nothing. Across from him, James Peterson scrolled through a tablet filled with documents. "So," James began, looking up. "Tell me exactly what happened." Marcus's voice was calm, deliberate. This morning, at the downtown brew on Main Street, I walked in as a customer. No one recognized me. Rachel Thompson, the head waitress, looked at me like I didn't belong. Told her colleague, loud enough for me to hear, "We don't serve people like that here." She overcharged me, lied about the system being down, served everyone else first. The others saw it. No one spoke up. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's bad." "But, Marcus, are you sure this isn't personal revenge?" Marcus's gaze shifted toward the skyline. "Revenge is emotion. I want justice. And a mirror. I want her to see herself the way the world should see her." The door opened quietly, and a man in a gray suit stepped in carrying a folder thick with papers. David Martinez, their private investigator. He placed the folder on the table. "You were right to call me," he said. "We've been monitoring social media related to Downtown Brew for a few weeks." Rachel Thompson's name came up more than once. She's part of a private group chat on WhatsApp called Elite Service Squad. It's a circle of employees from several upscale restaurants in the city. Marcus frowned. "What do they do in this group?" David flipped the folder open and slid several printed screenshots across the table. "They share techniques on how to discourage customers they consider undesirable. Overcharge them. Delay their orders. Pretend systems are down. It's racism, wrapped in customer service." James cursed under his breath. "You're saying this is organized?" David nodded. "Very. Rachel is one of the most active members. She calls it preserving the premium experience." Marcus studied the screenshots in silence. Rachel smiling in selfies, captions like, "Keeping standards high." He could almost hear her voice. "We don't serve people like that here." His jaw tightened, but his tone remained composed. "If this culture exists under my brand, then I've failed to protect the very values we built this company on." James leaned forward. "We can fire her, Marcus. Make an example. Quietly remove her, issue a statement, and move on." Marcus shook his head. "No. Firing her would teach her nothing. She'd just find another place to poison. I want her arrogance to become evidence. I want this entire pattern documented." He turned to David. "How much can we legally record?" David adjusted his glasses. "As the owner, you have full rights to document what happens in your establishment, as long as it's done without violating personal privacy outside of work. Cameras, audio, undercover observation, it's all legal if you're investigating misconduct." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. Then we do it right." He walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. The city stretched below, endless and indifferent. "Tomorrow," he said, "I go back in. Same disguise. No staff will be informed. I want to see if she does it again." James frowned. "You? Personally?" Marcus turned, his eyes steady. "She humiliated me thinking I was powerless. I want her to show the world who she truly is. On her own terms." Silence filled the room again, but this time it pulsed with something electric. David closed the folder. "I'll have my team set up recording devices, hidden cameras, microphones, everything off-site and synced." Marcus nodded. "Document everything. Every word, every transaction, every look." James sighed. "You're turning this into a full operation." Marcus smiled faintly. "No. I'm turning it into a lesson." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the sun began to set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in amber and gray. The reflection of Marcus in the window looked like a man standing between two worlds, the one he had built and the one he was about to change. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "Let her think she's untouchable. By the time this is over, she'll understand that equality isn't a slogan, it's policy. Late afternoon light spilled through the tall glass windows of downtown Brew, turning everything gold. The cafe buzzed softly with conversation, the sound of spoons against porcelain, the scent of roasted coffee thick in the air. Marcus Williams pushed open the door and stepped inside once more, wearing the same plain clothes as before. This time, beneath his shirt, a small microphone was clipped to his collar. A camera, no larger than a button, glinted faintly under the fabric. Hidden in plain sight. At two separate tables, David Martinez and two of his assistants sat posing as customers. One read a newspaper. Another scrolled through his phone. The third stirred a cup of tea he didn't intend to drink. All of them had recording devices running. Marcus walked calmly toward the counter. The bell above the door jingled softly, and Rachel looked up from wiping the counter. Her expression froze for half a second before a smirk appeared. She leaned toward Jennifer Walsh, the shift supervisor standing beside her. "Look who's back," she whispered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. Jennifer arched an eyebrow, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some people never learn." Their laughter was quiet but cruel. Marcus kept his face unreadable. He could feel the tension in the air, the kind that only exists when arrogance meets consequence and doesn't yet know it. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "I'd like an Americano, please." Rachel crossed her arms. "Of course," she said, her tone pretending politeness but layered with contempt. $15 today. Marcus tilted his head slightly. 15. Has inflation hit that fast? Jennifer leaned on the counter. "You understand economics, right?" she said, smiling the way people do when they think they're untouchable. From the corner, David's phone camera caught every word, every glance. Marcus reached for his wallet, pulling out a $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said quietly. Rachel took the bill between two fingers as if it carried disease. Behind her, the young barista, Tony, watched the exchange in silence. His movements were slower than usual, deliberate. When Marcus stepped closer to the counter, Tony's eyes flicked to the small black dot on Marcus's shirt. For a split second, their gazes met. Marcus saw it, recognition, fear, then something deeper. Understanding. Tony blinked once, a silent acknowledgement, then turned back to the espresso machine without saying a word. That moment, small, invisible to everyone else, meant everything. There was still conscience in this place. Rachel, oblivious, went on performing her cruelty. She poured his coffee lazily, then turned to serve a new customer, leaving Marcus waiting. Jennifer handed the cup to him when she finally noticed, using a cheap paper one again. "Here you go," she said flatly. "To go, I imagine." "Actually," Marcus replied, his voice calm, "I'd like to drink it here." Jennifer frowned. "Our tables are reserved for customers who order full meals." Marcus glanced around. 6 tables stood empty. "I see," he said. "But I think I'll stay." Rachel snorted quietly. "Suit yourself." The next 10 minutes felt longer than an hour. The camera in Marcus's shirt captured Rachel and Jennifer serving other customers, white couples, businessmen in suits, with smiles, jokes, and porcelain cups. The contrast was surgical, undeniable. Marcus didn't need to say a word. Every second was evidence. Every smirk, every dismissive gesture, every small act of disrespect was a confession captured in high definition. Tony glanced at Marcus again as he cleaned the counter nearby. His lips pressed into a line, his knuckles tight. He looked like a man holding back a storm. When the cafe quieted, Marcus stood, leaving the cup half full. As he walked toward the door, Rachel spoke again, her voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Some places just aren't for some people." The words carried the same poison as before, casual and practiced. Marcus paused at the door, turned slightly, and met her eyes. "You're right," he said softly, almost kindly. Some people just don't belong in certain places. For a brief instant, she smiled, thinking she'd won. She didn't know that every syllable had been recorded from 3 different angles, that her tone, her words, her arrogance were now preserved like fingerprints on glass. Marcus stepped outside into the fading sunlight. The door closed behind him, the golden reflection of the cafe shimmering on the glass. David joined him moments later on the sidewalk, phone in hand, eyes wide. "We got everything," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Good. This isn't just evidence." He looked back at the cafe where Rachel laughed with Jennifer, completely unaware of the storm about to break. "It's her mirror." The 2 men walked away as the last light of day slid down the skyscrapers, leaving downtown Brew glowing like a stage just before the curtain falls. The city was a sea of lights that night, 1,000 windows glowing against the dark. Inside Marcus's office, everything was still. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound breaking the silence. A single desk lamp cast a cold blue glow over piles of folders, screens, and notes. David Martinez sat across from Marcus, his face pale from exhaustion and the reflection of the monitor. In front of them lay a 40-page report, The Anatomy of Discrimination. "This," David said quietly, tapping the cover page, "is everything." Marcus flipped through it slowly. Photos. Screenshots. Transcripts. Audio logs. A list of coded entries from the register system labeled Special Protocol. Each code added hidden fees to orders from customers tagged under vague labels like Type C or Urban Profile. He didn't need anyone to explain what those words really meant. He could feel the weight of every page pressing against his chest. David cleared his throat. Rachel and Jennifer use the same code at least 15 times a week. They train new hires to do it. The WhatsApp group has over 20 members from different luxury cafes across the city. It's systematic. Marcus's fingers tightened slightly on the folder's edge. His eyes stayed calm, but his jaw flexed once. "How long have they been doing this?" "Over a year," David said. "Before you installed the new cameras." James Peterson stood by the window, watching the skyline. His tie hung loose, sleeves rolled up, a rare crack in his usual composure. "Marcus," he began carefully, "if this goes public, it could hurt your brand." "We're talking about corporate image, investors, the press," Marcus interrupted softly. "If I stay silent, I'll lose something bigger." He closed the folder, his voice steady. "My mother's promise." The word settled in the room like a verdict. James turned around slowly. "You're serious about making this public?" "No," Marcus said, looking up. "I'm serious about making it right." He walked toward the window, staring out over the city. The reflection in the glass showed a man caught between principle and power, but unwilling to surrender either. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I want every employee from downtown Brew here. No exceptions. The store stays closed until I say otherwise." David looked at him. "You're calling them all in?" "Yes. I want them to see what they've helped build, and what they've allowed to rot." James hesitated. "And Rachel?" Marcus turned back toward them. "Rachel will see herself clearly for the first time." The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady and merciless. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, fading into the night. Marcus rested both hands on the desk and exhaled slowly. "Make sure everything is documented," he said. "Tomorrow isn't about punishment. It's about revelation." David nodded, closing his laptop. "Understood." The men gathered their things and left, the echo of their footsteps fading down the hallway. When the door shut, Marcus was alone again. He looked at the closed report on his desk, 40 pages of truth, then turned off the lamp. The office fell into darkness, the skyline still burning beyond the glass. Somewhere across the city, Rachel Thompson was sitting in her small apartment, legs crossed, a glass of wine in hand. Her phone buzzed with notifications, likes, hearts, laughing emojis under her latest post. Another great day keeping the standards high at Downtown Brew. Her friend replied with a comment, maybe the boss noticed. You deserve a raise. Rachel smiled, flipping her hair. Oh, he noticed, she said aloud, a satisfied grin on her face. I always stand out. She didn't know that she was right, just not in the way she imagined. Tomorrow morning, the same arrogance she bragged about would be projected larger than life, under fluorescent lights, in front of every coworker she ever mocked. And by the time the sun rose over Los Angeles, Rachel Thompson's version of high standards would become the reason her world collapsed. Morning light crept across the polished floor of Downtown Brew, sliding over empty tables and silent machines. The sign on the door read, "Closed for staff meeting." Inside, 17 employees gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering. The air buzzed with curiosity and low chatter. Some thought it was an inspection, others a celebration. Rachel Thompson stood near the counter, her blonde hair perfectly tied, a confident smile curving her lips. Maybe it's a promotion meeting, she said, adjusting her apron. I told you, Jennifer, the higher-ups are finally noticing how I've been keeping the standards around here. Jennifer forced a small laugh, trying to match her friend's arrogance, but her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. At precisely 9 o'clock, the glass door opened. The room fell quiet. Marcus Williams entered, wearing a dark suit that caught the light, followed by James Peterson, David Martinez, and a composed woman in a navy blazer, Dr. Patricia Williams, a civil rights attorney. The sound of their shoes against the floor was the only noise. Rachel's smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. Marcus stopped at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his employees. Good morning, he said evenly. His voice carried the weight of command. My name is Marcus Williams. He paused. The room held its breath. And I am the owner of this coffee chain. For a split second, silence stretched like glass about to shatter. Then came the sound of someone's breath catching, Rachel's. The color drained from her face. Jennifer's lips parted, words dying before they could form. Around them, murmurs rippled through the staff. Marcus waited, letting the realization settle like dust. Over the past few weeks, he continued, I've been investigating reports of misconduct and discrimination within this branch. He turned toward the counter where Rachel stood frozen. I visited this store personally, twice. Once as a customer. Once as an investigator. Rachel blinked rapidly, her voice trembling into a nervous laugh. Sir, I don't understand. You were undercover. I was observing, Marcus said quietly. What I found was not only unacceptable, but illegal. He gestured toward David, who connected a projector to the wall. Morning light crept across the polished floor of Downtown Brew, sliding over empty tables and silent machines. The sign on the door read, Closed for staff meeting. Inside, 17 employees gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering. The air buzzed with curiosity and low chatter. Some thought it was an inspection, others a celebration. Rachel Thompson stood near the counter, her blonde hair perfectly tied, a confident smile curving her lips. Maybe it's a promotion meeting, she said, adjusting her apron. I told you, Jennifer, the higher-ups are finally noticing how I've been keeping the standards around here. Jennifer forced a small laugh, trying to match her friend's arrogance, but her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. At precisely 9 o'clock, the glass door opened. The room fell quiet. Marcus Williams entered, wearing a dark suit that caught the light, followed by James Peterson, David Martinez, and a composed woman in a navy blazer, Dr. Patricia Williams, a civil rights attorney. The sound of their shoes against the floor was the only noise. Rachel's smile faltered, confusion replacing confidence. Marcus stopped at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his employees. Good morning, he said evenly. His voice carried the weight of command. My name is Marcus Williams. He paused. The room held its breath. And I am the owner of this coffee chain. For a split second, silence stretched like glass about to shatter. Then came the sound of someone's breath catching, Rachel's. The color drained from her face. Jennifer's lips parted, words dying before they could form. Around them, murmurs rippled through the staff. Marcus waited, letting the realization settle like dust. Over the past few weeks, he continued, I've been investigating reports of misconduct and discrimination within this branch. He turned toward the counter where Rachel stood frozen. I visited this store personally, twice. Once as a customer. Once as an investigator. Rachel blinked rapidly, her voice trembling into a nervous laugh. Sir, I don't understand. You were undercover. I was observing, Marcus said quietly. What I found was not only unacceptable, but illegal. He gestured toward David, who connected a projector to the wall. The first image appeared, a screenshot of the WhatsApp group Elite Service Squad. Rachel's own name glowed at the top of the chat. Dozens of messages filled the screen, mocking customers, joking about charging extra for the experience, and describing tactics to keep certain people away from their tables. Gasps echoed around the room. That's taken out of context, Rachel stammered. This is harassment. You can't. Silence, Marcus said sharply, his tone cutting through the room. You'll have your chance to speak. David switched slides. Audio recordings played next, Rachel's voice from the day before, mocking Marcus, exaggerating her disgust. Some places just aren't for some people. The sentence filled the room, louder now, crueler in its repetition. Marcus looked at her calmly. That was you yesterday, Rachel. In my cafe. To me. The words hit like a physical blow. Rachel's confidence cracked, her eyes wide. You set me up, she shouted suddenly, her voice rising. You lied about who you were. That's entrapment. I'm going to sue you for harassment and discrimination against employees. Marcus didn't flinch. Dr. Williams, he said. The attorney stepped forward, her tone professional, unwavering. Under federal and state law, business owners are permitted to investigate suspected civil rights violations occurring on their property. The evidence collected here is admissible, as this is a public commercial space with no expectation of privacy. Furthermore, discriminatory practices toward customers fall under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title II. Her gaze fixed on Rachel. That means you, Ms. Thompson, are in violation of federal law. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. The room was utterly still. Marcus nodded once to David, who displayed the final slide, a table of receipts showing inflated prices, coded as premium adjustments. You see these? Marcus asked quietly. These are the special protocols you applied to customers who didn't fit your idea of premium. You stole their dignity and their money. Jennifer began to cry softly. Rachel stood rigid, her breathing uneven. You can't destroy my career over this, she whispered. You can't. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I'm not destroying anything, he said finally. I'm not doing anything. You did. The words landed like a gavel. He turned to the room, his voice firm but calm. Firing you isn't revenge, Rachel. It's repair. What you built here was a culture of exclusion. What I'm building next will be its opposite. He signaled to David, who handed Rachel a sealed envelope. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, for cause. You will also receive notification of pending civil review. Jennifer Walsh, you are also dismissed. Jennifer broke down completely, covering her face. Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the envelope, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. No one did. Even Tony, standing behind the counter, couldn't meet her eyes. You think this will make you a hero, she spat finally. You'll regret this. People like you always play the victim card. Marcus's tone didn't change. People like me built this business. People like you tried to poison it. He stepped aside, leaving her a clear path to the door. For a long moment, she stood there, frozen between pride and collapse. Then she walked out, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silent cafe. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No one spoke. Marcus looked at his remaining employees. Those who treated every customer with respect, you have nothing to fear. Those who didn't, this is your warning. This company will stand for dignity or it will not stand at all. Tony raised his eyes, voice quiet but steady. Sir, thank you. Marcus nodded once. No. Thank you for staying human. The meeting ended, but no one moved. Rachel's empty apron lay folded on the counter, a symbol of everything that had just ended. Outside, she stopped on the sidewalk, the sun glaring against her tears. For the first time, no one was looking at her with admiration. Only pity. Inside, Marcus stood still, breathing deeply. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't lost control. He had simply allowed truth to speak louder than anger. And as he turned to leave, the words of his mother returned to him like a quiet prayer. Dignity isn't given. It's kept. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the windows of the newly redesigned downtown brew, filling the cafe with warmth and color. The walls that had once felt sterile and judgmental now carried the energy of life, conversations in different accents, laughter shared between strangers, the sound of coffee cups clinking in rhythm with soft jazz. Near the entrance, a wooden plaque hung under a golden light. The engraving read, "To my mother, who taught me that dignity is not negotiable." Beneath it, fresh flowers stood in a vase that changed every week, a quiet tribute that regular customers had come to respect. Marcus Williams sat at his usual table by the window, the same place he had once been humiliated, though it no longer carried bitterness. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, unaware that inside these walls, a quiet revolution had taken place. The cafe was thriving. People of every color and background came and went freely, artists, bankers, students, and delivery drivers, all served the same way, with kindness that needed no instruction. At the counter, Tony moved with quiet confidence, wearing a crisp new uniform and a small nameplate that read, "Manager." He was speaking to a young trainee, showing her how to balance an order tray, his voice patient and encouraging. When he noticed Marcus watching, he smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from pride, not fear. Marcus lifted his cup in acknowledgement. Tony nodded back, the gesture saying everything words didn't need to. On the wall near the register hung a framed magazine cover. Entrepreneur magazine. Across the glossy page, a photo of Marcus looked out over a bold headline, "CEO of the Year, The Williams Protocol, How One Man Redefined Corporate Justice." The article had gone viral, celebrating how Marcus turned a scandal into a standard. The Williams Protocol was now being studied at business schools and adopted by major corporations, a model for accountability, empathy, and equal service. Still, Marcus avoided reading it too often. The magazine was just proof. The real reward was what he could see now, the simple harmony of people being treated right. A young waitress approached his table, her blonde hair tied back neatly, her expression open and kind. "Good morning, sir," she said with a cheerful tone. "Would you like a refill?" Marcus looked up at her. For the briefest moment, the past flickered, the cold tone, the sneer, the disposable cup. But this woman's smile held no arrogance, no performance, just sincerity. "Yes, please," he said softly. "Black. No sugar." "Of course," she replied, taking his cup carefully and walking away. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the sunlight brushing across his face. The smell of roasted coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Around him, customers greeted one another, holding doors open, sharing tables. Humanity, in its quietest form, had returned to this place. His eyes drifted toward the plaque again, reading his mother's words. He imagined her voice, tired but strong, repeating them at that old kitchen table years ago. Dignity isn't negotiable. He smiled. In the end, she had been right. Justice hadn't needed noise or spectacle. It had needed patience, truth, and time. Tony came over with a fresh cup, setting it gently on the table. "New roast," he said. "We call it Harmony Blend." Marcus chuckled softly. "Fitting name." Tony nodded. "Took me months to get it right. Thought you'd be the one to try it first." Marcus lifted the cup, inhaling the aroma. It was rich, warm, balanced. He took a sip, closing his eyes. No bitterness this time. Only depth, and peace. Outside, the traffic lights changed, the city moved on, but inside, everything felt still. His voice, calm and low, echoed in his mind like a closing thought. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet that follows when truth finally speaks. He set the cup down, looking out through the same glass he had once looked through in silence and shame. Now it reflected a man who had turned injustice into reform, humiliation into legacy. Downtown Brew was no longer a place that served coffee. It was a place that served dignity. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus Williams finally tasted something pure. Respect. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.